Today we're going to talk about cemeteries, specifically Oak Hill Cemetery. It's located off East Main Street and is one of the oldest cemeteries in the city. Like people, cemeteries have a history all their own, and we invite you to this Coffee with a Curator as we look at Oak Hill Cemetery in Bradford. Did you notice I specifically said Oak Hill Cemetery in Bradford? That's because there's also an Oak Hill Cemetery in Eldred. And people doing family research sometimes get confused when they call the Landmark Society. Cemeteries are often named after a prominent feature of the area. In this case, there were oak trees up on this hill. There are almost 100 cemeteries in McKean County, and some are very large and others are very small. Oak Hill is one of those that is very large. There's almost 16,000 people buried here. To learn the history of Oak Hill Cemetery, we're going to go back to 1833, to the early days of Bradford when it's called Littleton. There is no Oak Hill Cemetery then, or St. Bernard Cemetery, but a little tiny cemetery called Littleton on Kennedy Street. This is an old photograph of the Littleton Cemetery, and you can see it's off Kennedy Street. This cemetery was donated by a land company back in 1833 to the town of Littleton, and many of the early pioneer settlers were buried here. This was the first cemetery in Bradford and eventually held about 500 bodies. Today, this area is known as Hanley Park, and that'll be another subject of a Coffee with the Curator in the future. But right now, we're going to talk about Oak Hill Cemetery. Remember how I said that cemeteries have a history all their own? Well, this one sure did. By the 1880s, it was decided that another cemetery was needed, and this one should be abandoned. And this, of course, leads to the birth of Oak Hill Cemetery. Removal of the graves to Oak Hill Cemetery began in 1885, but it was slow. Remember, there usually aren't headstones here, except for those who were wealthy enough to have one, and many of them were just mounds of dirt and grass, overgrown. In 1899, an article in the Bradford Era wrote, "The old Kennedy Street Cemetery, which has long been a source of annoyance to Fourth Ward residents, will probably be abandoned in the near future." There were several good reasons for abandoning the cemetery, not just the fact that there was no longer any care being taken of the graves. The Erie Railroad had been laid out on the northern part of the cemetery, and it was now down to about 2 acres. There were health concerns, too. It was said that in many instances, 2 or 3 caskets had been buried in one grave, one on top of another. They said in the early days the Kennedy Street Cemetery was far enough away from the settled portion of the town, but the city had now grown up so much that it has become an objectionable feature. They decided all the rest of the bodies had to be removed. And Oak Hill Cemetery, which by now had been in existence almost 20 years, was the perfect location. This is a photograph of Oak Hill Cemetery, taken in 1898. The cemetery itself was founded in 1881 by a man named Philip Webster. Not only was Philip Webster an early settler of the Littleton, Bradford area, he was also an undertaker and was well acquainted with the need for a new cemetery. In 1880, he began negotiations to purchase a large plot of land off East Main Street. He eventually purchased 8.5 acres from a man named William Fisher, and you may know Fisher because of Fisher's Inn on East Main Street, for the purpose of establishing a cemetery. It was located about halfway between Bradford and Tarport on the east side of the main road. There was a big difference, of course, between this new cemetery, Oak Hill, and the old one off Kennedy Street. The Kennedy Street Cemetery was free, meaning there was no charge to bury someone there. But Oak Hill was different. It would sell plots of land, and they needed to be purchased. Once you bought a plot of land, It was yours, and a deed was issued by the recorder of deeds in the courthouse. The Bradford era wrote, "The general design embraces a roadway leading to the highest point in the enclosure by graceful curves, and leading from it are pathways winding to every point." This photograph was taken in 1901, and you can see that there are already several graves on Oak Hill. In the 1890s, Webster purchased more land for the cemetery, and by 1900 there were 17 acres of land comprising Oak Hill Cemetery. There are winding paths and roads, but if you want to drive up there today, you'd better be a fearless driver because some of those roads are very narrow. Back in the day, of course, it was all horse-drawn hearses and carriages. And today, of course, they use motorized vehicles. Now, Oak Hill is steep. And did you ever wonder the effort it must have taken to get a coffin up some of those hills? Well, one of the ways is to come down from above. The BB&K Railroad ran along the top of the cemetery, and a large gate was constructed that opened up onto the cemetery. If your cemetery plot was located near the top of the cemetery, or on an unfortunately steep part of Oak Hill Cemetery, you could put the coffin on the BB&K Railroad and transport it to the top of the cemetery that way. Webster said it was for the convenience of funerals from town and avoided the use of a hearse and carriage. Of course, the pallbearers had to be strong enough to unload it from the train and walk it down the hill. Now, Bradford doesn't have very many statues, only two in fact, and both of them are located on Oak Hill Cemetery. This one honors the veteran soldiers who fought in the Civil War. This is from an old postcard about 1912 that shows the Civil War soldier. Notice that cannon at the base of the statue. It's not there anymore. All the cannons in Bradford were donated during World War II to the scrap drive. This is the other statue that stands at Oak Hill. It's a fireman statue. This monument stands over the grave of 21 firefighters. It was dedicated in August of 1909, in time for that year's Old Home Week. The idea for a fireman monument came about in 1909. The city was then organizing a paid fire department, and the 7 volunteer fire departments, which had been fighting fires in the city, would be disbanded. It was decided to take whatever money left in the treasuries of those fire departments and put it towards a statue on Oak Hill Cemetery. Of the 21 bodies buried beneath this statue, some originally had been buried elsewhere. Remember the old Bradford Cemetery we talked about at the beginning of this video? Some of the firefighters were there, and their bodies were moved sometime after 1909. And then, of course, there's the Community Mausoleum, that very large building you can see at the top of Oak Hill as you drive down the 219 Expressway or up on East Main Street. It was dedicated in May of 1915. As I said in the beginning of this video, cemeteries have a history all their own, and Oak Hill Cemetery certainly does. And if you're interested in knowing who's buried there, we do have a list of all the headstones in Oak Hill Cemetery and also the cemetery records of who's buried there. You might be surprised to know how many people call the Bradford Landmark Society wanting to find their old relatives that are buried on this hill. And usually we can help them. And of course, not only cemeteries are interesting, but so are the headstones and the people that are buried there.